This program is made possible in part by the Moving Image Trust Fund.
Well, of course you know Michael Hibblen, the news director of KUAR, Public Radio for Central Arkansas. And he's hardly a stranger to the AETN television audience, being a frequent panelist on Arkansas Week. But you're forgiven for not knowing that Michael Hibblen is one of those railroad freaks. Those men and women, and some boys and girls, who find romance in the rails, who hear symphonies in the roar of the locomotive, in the shrill of the whistle, and one railroad in particular, the Rock Island. Michael's new book, The Rock Island in Arkansas, is at once a celebration and a lament, and author, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
When did this love affair of yours begin?
Really, it was second grade. I grew up in North Little Rock, and at that time, every third year for school, because of the ongoing desegregation efforts, you'd be bused to a different part of town. And for second grade, in the fall of 1979, I was bused to Redwood Elementary. It's about 2 blocks off of Broadway, and directly in front of the school was the busy main line for the Rock Island Railroad. And I loved trains at the time, wasn't familiar with the Rock Island up until that point, but I enjoyed watching trains when I was at school. Out at recess, I'd hear the trains go by. Sometimes even in my classes, teachers during art or whatnot would let me go over to the window and watch trains. I didn't know it at the time, but it was a time when the Rock Island was really struggling. And the following March in 1980, the Rock Island was shut down. And it really struck a chord with me. And it's what started me wanting to learn more about what happened. So by high school, 11th grade English class, you had to write a research paper. They wanted you to do something original, and I thought, well, let me find out what happened to the Rock Island Railroad. Yeah. And that's when I started what's really been 30 years of on-again, off-again research. I interviewed my first former Rock Island employee at that time, went over to the Arkansas Gazette, got a lot of information through their clip files and whatnot, and it's been a passion of mine that I've kind of looked into over the years.
Michael, we'll pause for a moment to note that growing up as you did in North Little Rock, North Little Rock was not exclusively a railroad town, but the railroads were integral to North Little Rock. They were as much North Little Rock, say, as the Cotton Belt was at Pine Bluff. North Little Rock wasn't the only town that had a heavy railroad presence or influence.
Right, and it had originally been the western end for the first railroad in Arkansas, the Memphis and Little Rock. You also had, by that time, the Missouri Pacific, what's today Union Pacific, has a huge shop over there and yard, and you had 3 railroads that served North Little Rock. North Little Rock was pretty much created by the railroads.
When did it take the Rock Island? What are its roots?
The Rock Island expanded into Arkansas in 1902 with a hostile takeover of the Choctaw, Oklahoma, and Gulf. It had started about 30 or 40 years before that in the Chicago area and slowly grew. But in Arkansas, it entered with the acquisition, this hostile takeover of the Choctaw, Oklahoma, and Gulf. It was created at the end of the 1800s to connect coal resources with Memphis, Tennessee, and the Mississippi River in particular. And as the Rock Island was growing nationwide, it eyed the Choctaw, Oklahoma, and Gulf as a strong railroad. It had just expanded greatly. It had taken over what had been the Memphis and Little Rock. It invested a lot of money in the state. It built the bridge that still stands crossing the Arkansas River, what was the Rock Islands Bridge. It's now part of the Clinton Presidential Library. It built the Grand Passenger Station that is today the Clinton School of Public Service. It says the Choctaw Route on it. And it also expanded west and did indeed connect Memphis all the way to Oklahoma. It was part of a time when the Rock Island was expanding aggressively and moved into the state. It acquired parts of what had been 32 different railroads in Arkansas. And at its peak, it had a huge footprint in the state.
Yeah, it prospered in those early days.
It did. And it also had its times of struggling, too. Like most railroads, there were times it would enter bankruptcy, do a reorganization, and would eventually emerge. That had happened 2 times early in the 20th century, but in 1975 is when it really hit a time of struggling. And there's a deep history behind that, but it ended up in bankruptcy in 1975 and eventually was shut down in 1980.
It's all what you mentioned, the proliferation, or the abundance anyway, of comparatively small, even tiny railroad companies in Arkansas and other states at the time. It makes one think almost of school districts. You know, every little tiny community had a small school district. A lot of them had their own railroad, basically.
Right. When railroads were first being created, oftentimes it would just be a line created to connect 2 small towns. And people today don't always realize the impact of railroads, and that was really how goods as well as people got around. Back before you had, paved roads or major highways, much less the interstate system that came in the 1950s. But it was the key way that people got around toward the end of the 1800s and the first part of the 20th century. And it was a vital way of getting goods and commerce and people around.
Where was the focus anyway, the primary focus? Where was the money made? Was it in raw materials, finished products, goods, or passengers?
In Arkansas, it depends what section you're talking about. In South Arkansas, you had timber was key for the Rock Island. El Dorado, when oil was first discovered there in the 1920s, that's when you had, I believe it was about 90% of the oil discovered there was being taken out by the Rock Island. But it was a major passenger railroad line. Its Sunbelt route, which was the main line that went from Memphis to Little Rock and on west into Oklahoma, and could then take people down to Amarillo, Texas. They could then get connection service with the Southern Pacific and go all the way to Los Angeles. It was a major way for people to get around. You also had trains that went directly from Chicago to Hot Springs. As part of a connection with the Illinois Central, passengers could take nonstop or connecting trains through trains from Chicago. In Memphis, it would be picked up by the Rock Island, and it would run first-class trains all the way into Hot Springs. And that was when Hot Springs was known as a big resort town. You had the hot springs coming out of the water, and there were known for other activities, gambling. You had organized crime. You had the mafia people who are, so known now, who would travel directly from Chicago, and Hot Springs was another little playground for them.
I note one of the advertisements that you captured in the book boasted that one could now travel from Memphis to Amarillo in something like 30 hours.
Yeah.
And this was an astonishing and in comfort, with dining cars and multiple meals, snacks, whatever.
Well, at that time, when you consider what you did have, otherwise you'd be going in a slow-moving automobile, and at that time highways weren't fully developed, and you weren't always assured of, service for your vehicle, and so it was considered almost miraculous to be able to travel like that in that time.
The Rock and other railroads, and to some extent still do, but those lines put a lot of food on a lot of families' tables, and they made comparatively good living.
They did. To get on board with the Rock Island.
Make a career at the railroad.
Yeah, and a lot of times you had several generations within one family that would work for the Rock Island. Some said it was nepotism, but it really was. That's how you would have, several generations. And if you got on board with the Rock Island, that was a good living because you could build up seniority, you would have job stability, and once you started building seniority, you had a good income for the rest of your life. You could provide for your families. So it was aggressive to get that opportunity.
Not that we don't now, but America and the South needed railroads. I mean,
yeah. It, when you look at the ways that people got around at the time, when the Rock Island and its predecessors in Arkansas built those tracks, it enabled people to get around in ways they had never been able to. And that was really key, a lot of people say, to the development of the state. It took a lot of effort at that time to lay the rails because you didn't necessarily have the heavy equipment you do today. You had to actually get a lot of manpower out there to build up the grade and to actually construct the track.
And that was backbreaking work. That was a feat of engineering in and of itself, particularly when you talk about laying track through the mountainous regions of Arkansas or that spongy soil over in the Delta.
Yeah, the flat land over there, especially the Delta between Brinkley and Memphis, so swampy. It took so much effort to build up that track and to actually get it where the trains could flow on it. That took, it's unfathomable how much effort it actually took and money to lay those rails. And when you had, say, flooding, there were several instances of flooding in the 1920s and 30s, and a lot of times the only way to get around was by rail. And in fact, the Rock Island, because highways would be underwater for months at a time, the Rock Island even ran shuttle trains where they would let people drive their cars up onto flat cars, and the railroads, the tracks would still be up, and you have a few pictures of that in the book, but the railroads would actually then move these passengers through the flooded areas. They could stay in their cars, or they could load their cars and then get into the passenger coaches. But it was a key way to get around during times like that.
Provided a lot of middle-class families with or middle-class income, and it allowed people to move up in terms of income. But it could also be dangerous work. Railroading wasn't easy work.
Yeah, you didn't have block signals come in really until the 1950s. You had a lot of times where you had deadly accidents where someone could just overlook one train on an order slip, and then you would have a horrific head-on collision. Unfortunately, it happened a lot in the railroads, or just one mistake. One person I interviewed, a former employee, most employees, if they spent a few decades working for the railroad, had a few close calls, and just kind of slip, you lose your footing, you could easily fall off a train. All kinds of horrific stories like that. And or in another instance, there was a guy who I interviewed, his name was Guy Winters, and he told the story of one time he accidentally flushed his locomotive's brakes. And what that basically meant is that the only stopping power he had for this huge freight train was the cars on his, in the back of the train, the freight cars, and he ran through a signal that told him there was going to be a passenger train at the next depot at Ola, Arkansas. And he was not able to stop his train. He came around a corner and was expecting to see a passenger train sitting there. And much to his relief, the passenger train had just moved on. He was
expecting to die, it sounds like.
He was expecting to die, but he also expected that, worse still, he would be killing a lot of passengers. He said over and over, women and children. That's what he was thinking. But fortunately, he came around the corner. The passenger train had just stopped. He had already thrown the train into emergency, but he said he just got off the locomotive when it did finally stop and shook for a few minutes. Just said it was just so terrifying for him, the prospect of that one mistake that he made and the impacts that could have happened. I heard so many stories like that in the employee interviews that I recorded over the years.
You mentioned Ola, and you have a route map of the Rock Island in the book. But it seems so many small towns, communities. There was a depot there.
That was
that station house.
Yeah, and those depots would be the center of the community. And if you go through where you still have the old Rock Island depots standing today, Carlisle, Hazen, Lone Oak, Brinkley, those were the centers of the towns, and they were sort of the lifeblood to the outside world. That's where people kind of went out to the depot to, get mail first off, or to just to feel a connection with the outside world. Back in the days before you had broadcasting or other ways to get around, or the telephone even, the depot was where people arrived. And every town at that time, railroads needed to service the engines, the locomotives regularly, especially in the steam days. And every town they would get to would have another depot, and that's where they'd get servicing. Passengers would get on, get off. Mail, that was a key way that mail was distributed around the country for the Postal Service.
You mentioned the engineer who got lucky that day at Ola. When you are interviewing these veterans of the Rock Island and other railroads too, did they have something in common, a sense of their own romance, a sense of history that they had participated in? Did they share that with you in any way? Could you detect that in there?
Some did. It was interesting because some clearly did appreciate railroads. I was actually surprised how many employees, because I was primarily seeking photos for this book, I was surprised how many never took a single photograph. Some looked at it as this is going to work, didn't see it maybe necessarily as history, but you quickly learn. You spend a few decades, you see the changes and how railroads, like most other industries, are constantly evolving. But some did have a great appreciation for that, just depended on the particular employee.
Sure. I guess I was wondering whether for many of them it was a labor of love as well as a labor for the family. I mean, it means sustenance.
It was indeed a labor of love. And what struck me, and I dedicated the book to the employees who kept the railroad running through great adversity until it was finally shut down, it really was a family camaraderie, especially on the Rock Island. After the railroad was shut down, I talked to employees who then went to work for different railroads and really learned what a family operation the Rock Island was, how employees really did look out for one another in ways even beyond at other railroads, and sometimes protected employees, when mistakes happened. In the instance of the story at Ola, there was no official report made about that because they
got lucky. They
got lucky, so no reason to bring in the Interstate Commerce Commission.
Well, you mentioned the ICC, no longer extant, but what happened to the Rock Island? It took decades for it to die, but it...
Yeah, it was a struggling era for railroads after World War II. World War II was the railroads were the main way that you got troops out. And in a lot of places, like for instance the Little Rock train station, that's where troops would depart and head over for World War II. It's where they would see their families, and in some cases see their families for the last time. Or if they made it back from the war, it's where families would greet their relatives. The depots were just, if you can imagine, sometimes they seem like old buildings now, but the people who came through there, the things that happened in these depots are really amazing, or in some cases, if they were killed in service. I've heard many stories that the Little Rock train station is where the families would come to claim the body. But after World War II, you had growth of the interstate system. Eisenhower really pushed for the interstate system to be built, and that took a lot of passengers off of the railroad trains. You also had a lot of trucks start being moved more and more on the interstate system. The interstates were federally subsidized, and that also worked against railroads. So it was a time when railroads began struggling, and you had railroads looking for ways to cut expenses and find a way to survive. The beginning of the end, really, for the Rock Island came in 1964. A plan was devised for Rock Island to merge with Union Pacific. Today you have Union Pacific in Arkansas, but at that time it was not. That time it was Missouri Pacific, and that's who Union Pacific ended up acquiring in the 1980s. In 1964, Union Pacific and Rock Island proposed a merger plan, and the Southern Division that included Arkansas would go to the Southern Pacific, and it began what is said to have been the longest, most complicated merger case ever considered by the Interstate Commerce Commission. You had a lot of other railroads opposed to this, said it would create an unfair competition environment with just this giant railroad, and a lot of them fought the railroad. The Rock Island at that time stopped doing infrastructure in its mainly its track. The track really went downhill. The equipment really wasn't being maintained very well, and you started getting slow orders out on the line. Even the main line, what had once run grand passenger trains, the Choctaw Rocket, which ran, some employees said they would run it up to 90 miles an hour. The track got to be in such poor shape that trains were limited in some areas to 10 miles per hour. You started having derailments constantly, and everything went downhill for the Rock Island. And by the time the merger was given the approval by the ICC, the Union Pacific backed away, said it would cost too much money for us to upgrade this now, and we don't want it, and just walked away from the deal. And the Rock Island almost immediately filed for bankruptcy in 1975, attempted a reorganization. They got some federal subsidies to reopen a car shop at Biddle Yard, the main yard in Little Rock, but there was a creditor, one creditor in particular, a guy named Henry Crown, who said that the Rock Island was worth more dead than alive. And during this reorganization, he continually pushed for the Rock Island to be shut down and liquidated. You then had a strike that occurred in 1979. Kind of a complicated matter. Some of it goes to federal union politics. You had a union leader who had just lost a major strike on another railroad, where the railroad management said, okay, we'll continue running trains without the employees, and effectively did. And then when the Rock Island was due back wages, ended up putting a fight, and Rock Island employees ended up going on strike. And that was really the final nail in the coffin for the Rock Island. You had management that attempted to keep trains running, but you had this creditor, again, pushing for the railroad to be liquidated, and said that this strike was just another example of problems within the railroad. I should also back up and say there had been arguments up until this point that there was too much redundancy among railroads in the United States. Too many communities were served by different railroads, that we needed to thin down the number of railroads operating, and that would make railroads overall more profitable in the U.S. It was also just a time when railroads in general were struggling. But in March of 1980, a judge had ordered the Rock Island be liquidated. The order came down, I believe, in January of 1980, and they began embargoing cars and moving them to central locations. And in March of 1980, that's when you did finally have the Rock Island shut down. And to back up to the beginning of our conversation, that was when me, as a second grader, I noticed the train stopped going by in front of my school. The Cotton Belt acquired the Rock Island, operated it for 90 days, but then after that, the railroad in Arkansas, except for a few isolated spots that were picked up by other lines, for the most part, were abandoned.
It was you as a second grader who got into it. It was a first-term governor who had tried to play a role, tried to rescue, in effect, the Rock Island, keep, or some of the jobs anyway, open like that. His name was Bill Clinton.
Yep, Governor Clinton, serving his first term in office between 1978 and 1980. And this was a huge crisis for Arkansas. At that time, the Rock Island had about 800 employees in the state who would be losing their jobs.
Good jobs.
Good jobs. And you also had a lot of communities that were very concerned about this. You had places like Boonville and others that didn't have servicing by another railroad, had commodities that had to get in and out. In the case of Boonville, they had a couple of factories along the Rock Island, and I went through the files of Governor Clinton. They're kept at the Butler Center, largely unprocessed, but I was able to go through a file that really a box load of papers that were maintained by the governor's office, and they included letters and the governor's replies from people concerned about it, or other railroads saying, you know, you shouldn't, you know, if you want a railroad, you know, infrastructure in the state, you need to go ahead and let this end. But the governor's office was very concerned about this, and there were a lot of plans floated. There were efforts to try and get other railroads to come in and acquire what had been the Rock Island tracks in the state. There were issues with the union's obligations that scared off other railroads, and in the end, you didn't have any other railroads come in because they might have to hire Rock Island employees, they might have to pay back wages, a whole host of other factors. Then you had a plan presented. It was one lawmaker in particular, Lloyd George of Danville, one of these rail lines that was served by the Rock Island, and he proposed the state buy the track. This had happened in other states, and then the state would lease them out to other railroads. That didn't last in the legislature, and eventually the railroads were pretty much sold for scrap. The rails picked up and just sold for the raw steel.
Well, we don't have the Rock Island, but we have the memories in your book. Michael Hibblen, thanks very much for the book.
Thank you.
And for your time.
Thanks.
Michael Hibblen, the Rock Island Railroad in Arkansas. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
This program is made possible in part by the Moving Image Trust Fund.